The sack had been on her head for so long that the world had shrunk to breathe in pain, to the scrape of rope against her wrists and the steady sway of the horse beneath her. And when she whispered, "Please, don't take the sack off," her voice sounded like it belonged to someone already half gone, a woman speaking from the far side of herself, because she knew the truth most people learned too late in the West, that some sights once seen could never be unseen. And Ezekiel Crow heard her even though the wind was howling across the flats and the sun was sinking like a wound in the sky, staining the dunes the color of old blood. And he slowed the horse, his big hand tightening on the reins, his chest heavy with a weight he had been carrying for years without knowing its shape. He had found her at the edge of the salt basin, collapsed beside a dry arroyo, the sack tied cruelly tight around her head, her dress torn, her body shaking, not from cold, but from the kind of fear that settled into bone. And he had cut the ropes from her wrists with a blade so worn it had lost its shine, lifted her onto his horse without a word, because words were dangerous. Things out here, and often led to promises a man couldn't keep. Now, miles from anywhere that mattered, with night pressing close and the horse snorting uneasily, she begged again, softer, like a prayer she didn't expect, answered, and Ezekiel felt something inside him fracture, a hairline crack running through the hard, practical shell he'd built after the war, after the burning of Red Willow, after the day he learned that survival didn't always look like living. He told himself the sack was just cloth, that whatever marks lay beneath it were none of his business, that mercy sometimes meant not looking too closely, but the way her shoulders trembled told him this was no ordinary fear, and the bruise he could see darkening her cheek where the sack had slipped spoke of hands that hadn't known restraint. He dismounted, boots sinking into the sand, and stood in front of her, the horse shifting behind them, the wide land holding its breath, and he asked her name because it felt like the last decent thing he might be allowed to do. She hesitated, then said, "Clara Hale," and the name struck him like a blow, because Hale was a name that carried weight in this territory, a name tied to a ranch upriver, to a man Ezekiel had once known, a man who had stood on the wrong side of a line drawn in blood. "Clara," he repeated, tasting it, and she flinched as if names themselves could hurt, and he understood then that the sack wasn't just hiding wounds, it was hiding history. She told him they'd come at dawn, 3 men with dust on their coats and God's judgment in their eyes, saying her father had debts, saying land could be paid for in more ways than one, and when she had fought they had laughed, and when she had screamed they had silenced her with the sack, and all the while she had prayed not for rescue but for blindness, because shame was a thing that survived even when hope did not. Ezekiel listened, his jaw tight, the old anger stirring, the kind that had once made killing feel like a form of justice. And he told himself he was not that man anymore, that the war had taken enough from him. But the West did not care for the stories men told themselves. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, his fingers brushing the knot at the back of her head, and she stiffened, her breath coming fast, and said again, "Don't, please don't, because if you see me, you'll know, and if you know, you won't be able to leave, and I don't want to be the reason another man dies." The words cut deeper than any knife, and Ezekiel closed his eyes, seeing other faces, other women, other choices that had ended in graves, and for a moment he considered honoring her wish, leaving the sack in place, riding on until he could leave her at the edge of some town and wash his hands of whatever fate had thrown them together. But the bruise on her cheek burned in his mind, and the way she said his name when she learned it, like she was already measuring him against something she feared, and he knew that turning away now would be another kind of taking. He told her softly that whatever was under the sack did not belong to the men who hurt her, that it belonged to her alone, and maybe to the world if she chose. And his voice surprised him with its steadiness, with the way it carried something like belief. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain that might never fall, and the horse stamped, and time stretched thin as wire, and Clara's shoulders sagged in a way that felt like surrender rather than consent. And she whispered, "If you see, you can't unsee." And Ezekiel answered, "I've been living with that truth a long time." He loosened the knot carefully, as if gentleness itself might be a kind of absolution, and the sack slipped inch by inch, revealing first the line of her jaw, then her mouth set in a grim line of endurance, then her cheek mottled with bruises old and new, and when the cloth finally fell away and her eyes were exposed to the dying light, Ezekiel froze, because staring back at him was not just a battered young woman, but the unmistakable gaze of her father, the same gray eyes that had once watched Ezekiel choose mercy over vengeance, the same eyes that had begged him to walk away from a fight that would change everything. And in that moment, the past surged up like a flood, carrying with it debts unpaid and blood unavenged. And as Clara looked at him, recognition flickering across her face in slow, terrible clarity, Ezekiel understood that fate had not brought them together by accident, and whatever choice he made next would bind them both to a reckoning neither of them could. Of Cheap Grill. The moment recognition settled between them, it felt like the land itself shifted, as if the desert had decided to remember along with them, and Clara's breath caught when she finally said his name, Mr. Crow, not accusing, not pleading, just heavy with a truth she could no longer avoid. And Ezekiel felt the old debt rise up, the one he'd never repaid to her father, the man who had spared him years ago when blood would have been easier, the man whose kindness had been swallowed by a brutal country that rarely rewarded such things. He turned away for a second, steadying himself, because finishing this story meant stepping back into violence he had sworn off, but leaving meant letting cruelty win again, and the West had already taken too much from him for him to allow that. He told her he would take her to Red Hollow by nightfall, a place that barely deserved to be called a town, but had a doctor and enough eyes to keep predators cautious. And when she asked about the men who had hurt her, his silence was answer enough, a silence filled with intent rather than fear. They rode hard, the sky darkening, and with every mile Clara's strength returned in quiet ways, her spine straightening, her voice gaining weight. And she told him pieces of herself that had nothing to do with what had been taken, about how she'd wanted to leave the ranch, how she'd learned to read by lantern light, how she believed that destiny wasn't something handed down but something forged in the moments people thought didn't matter. When the men found them just outside Red Hollow, where the land narrowed and escape became impossible, Ezekiel did not hesitate, because hesitation was how good men died, and the fight was fast and ugly and final. Dust and gunfire and old rage colliding under a moon that watched without judgment. When it was over, Ezekiel stood breathing hard, knowing there was no road back from what he had done, but also knowing some lines were meant to be crossed only once, and Clara, shaking but standing, looked at him not with horror, but with understanding, the kind born of shared consequence. He saw then that survival did not always mean staying clean. Sometimes it meant staying human. In Red Hollow, the doctor said she would heal, that scars faded even when memories did not. And as dawn broke, Clara stepped outside, barefaced in the new light, the sack gone forever. And Ezekiel realized she had never been asking him not to see her. She had been asking him not to reduce her to what others had done. He left before noon because that was the kind of man he was. But when he looked back from the ridge, he saw her standing tall in the street, alive in a way that felt defiant. And he understood that destinies sometimes crossed not to stay together, but to change direction forever. And as the dust swallowed him and her story carried on without him, one truth remained, steady as the horizon. In the Wild West, courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to face it. And if this story stirred something in you, if you believe that fate can be challenged and broken by a single brave choice, then ride with us again, subscribe to Western Destiny Tales, and keep walking these hard roads where survival, sacrifice, and hope still fight to be seen.